Hi there, I'm Karen Brown of Just Get It Done Quilts, and welcome to Karen's Quilt Circle. We take color for granted. It's hard to believe in this day and age where we have access to all colors of the rainbow, how once some colors were financially unobtainable, and some were just illegal for you to wear. Today's guest, Kassia St, has done a deep dive on color in her best-selling book, The Secret Lives of Color. And she very generously answered all my questions, including the pink for boys, blue for girls reversal. So grab your sewing and a cup of tea, and here's my interview with Kassia St. Thank you very much for being on the show today. Just so excited to have you. The Secret Lives of Color is one of my favorite reads this past year. I love color and have loved color all my life. And it is such a readable little book. How did you come to love color?
I think there's sort of a couple of different answers. I think as a child, my mother was a florist. And so I went to day school in London when I was little. And on my way home, I would walk home from school via her flower shop, and I would sort of sit and just wait while she closed up the shop. And to kind of keep me entertained, any blooms that hadn't, were a bit crushed and that weren't making it into the proper bouquets, I would be given to make little posies, and these would be sold, quote unquote. I believe that they were being sold in the shop alongside the proper bouquets, and I would get kind of 20p next time I came into the shop, because someone had loved my little posy so much. So I think I kind of grew up, she was quite artistic, and I grew up kind of appreciating color and thinking about putting colors together. And we were quite a kind of artistic family. She loved making little stamps out of potatoes so that we could do like arts and crafts days and stuff like that. But then when I became older and was became interested in color academically was when I was at university. I studied history, and more specifically still, I studied women's history in the 18th century in London, and even more specifically, what women wore to masquerade balls in the 18th century in London, which was brilliant, a brilliant topic to study. And actually, for the most part, it meant reading diaries, letters, and kind of accounts of great parties, these great masquerade balls. And, preparing for these balls would take invitees several months. They really put a lot of effort and thought into their costumes and making them and all the rest of it. And something that I saw again and again from these letters and from these accounts was that there was this kind of separate color language. They would describe in very vivid detail the costume that they were planning, the costume that they had worn. And quite often there would be a color description and I wouldn't understand it, or it wouldn't have any meaning for me. And that was very surprising. And I would have to go down these little research rabbit holes trying to work out exactly what this costume looked like. And if I was very lucky, there might be a portrait surviving that might give me a hint, with the specific color term. But I found it kind of incredible that color language had shifted so much, in a period of a few hundred years. And as I researched further, I realized that this was happening all the time, and that, this wasn't really all that surprising at all. And that each generation has its own color language. Colors are kind of quite ephemeral. They can kind of come in and out of fashion. And color language changes as, because they're descriptions, and the descriptions have to have currency to the generation that are using them. And this just remained a kind of fascination of mine. And I ended up writing a column about colour for a British magazine called Elle Decoration, and the book came from that colour column.
I used to work in clothing accessories, and we were doing business with the Gap, and in Canada there was a company called Northern Reflections, and they spent an enormous amount of time choosing their color names. Like a navy wouldn't be a navy, it would be an ink or a midnight, or a pink would be a blanket. But those names have not made it into our color lexicon. Like you talk about shocking pink and Kelly green. You just touched upon it just a second ago. What is the difference in the color that becomes defining?
So I think there are a few things, and different colors can survive for a long time for different reasons. So if you look at a color like imperial purple, I think that's kind of lasted a long time because it had such huge cultural sway in the ancient world, and so it kind of retained its currency for a long time. But if you look at something like Kelly Green, it is kind of piggybacked on a kind of another cultural phenomenon, this idea of Irishness and particularly in Northern America. And so Kelly Green is kind of piggybacked on kind of a wider cultural phenomenon. And then the other thing I think is slightly the kiss of death, I think, for a color, sometimes that it can become too popular. And I think if you're a color and you want to last a very long time, you don't want to become incredibly fashionable, because then people will tire of you and you'll disappear. So you sort of want to be popular, but not too popular. And I think that's the sort of secret to color name longevity, is if you can hit that kind of sweet spot where enough people know who you are and like you, but you're not, like that song that you hear on the radio 15 times a day and then you never want to hear it again.
One thing I found very fascinating about the book is that I just presume, or I live in a time where almost all colors I have instantaneous access to. Like if I want to, I'm a quilter, if I want to make a quilter, not just in red, but in an orange red, I pretty well have access to that color. Where you get into, those colors were not available. And even if they were available, they were not necessarily stable and going to last very long.
Yeah, I think it is incredible to me that we have such kind of a democratic access to colors now, and that's a wonderful thing. But I also think the flip side of that is that we're no longer as appreciative of certain colors as our ancestors were. They would have known and appreciated, they'd have seen someone wearing a particular shade and gone wow, and appreciated the art of the dyer, the hours and the workmanship and the craftsmanship that had gone into making a particular shade. But unlike them, they might have appreciated that color for the skill that went into making it, but you might have gone your whole life without ever being able to wear certain colors, either because there were literally laws against certain classes of people wearing certain colors. That's something that happened all over Europe and in many other countries as well. There were a lot of laws regulating what people could wear. You see it in Japan, you see it in medieval Europe and France and all over the place. But also because some of these colors were so expensive and luxurious that you might never be able to wear a color, to have access to that color. The closest you ever got to it might be when you saw, the richest person ever, riding a horse down through your village, for example, and that might be the only time that you saw it. Or more likely, you might see a religious figure giving a mass or some sort of ceremony, and that would probably be the closest you might get to a really sumptuous color, and that's a great shame in a lot of ways.
That's a big shocker to me. I never even thought of classes being defined by color. Is that general knowledge in history, or is that something that you discovered?
One of the modules that I studied at university was medieval history. And when I studied medieval history, that came up. But I think it is something quite surprising to people. I think people, if you ask them about it, might intuitively know that some dyes would be more expensive than others. I think people can understand that certain colors are related to royalty, and if you were to push them on it, they'd probably say, well, they're probably quite expensive. But the idea that there are actual laws defining that, I think, would be really surprising. But I think the other thing is the best interpretation we can put on these laws, particularly in somewhere, England, where these laws were passed. There were a lot of laws passed that regulated these time and time again. That suggests that people weren't sticking to them. So it suggests that there was always a desire for people to kind of test the color boundaries. And if they had, if they were given a gown, if they were a servant and they were given, a mistress's or a master's gown, they would want to wear that, whether it was, technically legally allowed or not. So I think you can see just the constant passing of more and more laws trying to regulate this, that this is something that people were always rebelling against.
Is this a complete list of all your stories, or were there some that didn't make the cut?
No. So when I pitched the book, I think I picked around about the same number of colors, maybe a few fewer. But what I found very interesting in the writing is that I wanted to get the kind of all the chapters roughly the same length. I didn't want to have loads of yellows and no reds, for example, or no greens. So I knew that was kind of an artificial constraint, and because some colors, because they're a lot more because people have tried to they were a lot, rare, or they were a lot more expensive. People have constantly tried to kind of get, cheaper versions of those colors, and so you get more and more and more of them. So there were some, red is the classic example, because reds are very kind of sought after and expensive. There are lots of reds, so I could have written probably double the amount. But the other thing is, as I was writing, some of the colors that I thought would be very beautiful and would have really beautiful stories to go with them, you'd start researching, and it was hard to just find one story that would pull everything together in a really satisfying way. The book is about color, but I also wanted to make each little nugget really, a good story in its own right, so it's kind of complete. And that was a lot more challenging for some colors than others, and some you just started writing and they just started turning into mush, and then I had to kind of ditch them and find something else to take their place that would sort of work better.
I love the names. Like, if you tell anybody puce, people know exactly what color you're talking about. Were there any colors that changed with time?
Absolutely. So magenta, now we kind of think very much of the printer ink, but magenta has had quite a kind of a varied life. Sometimes it's been, that bright pinky red, nearly red, and then sometimes it's been purple. And then for my dad's partner, I asked her about it, and for her, she was like, oh, magenta, that's kind of, a mauvey color, which was really surprising to me. But it seems like, particularly with some colors, they're useful words that kind of have some sort of currency, but maybe the consumer isn't totally aware. And so brands can kind of pull in names and be a bit, play a little bit fast and loose with exactly what they might mean. And I think particularly with the English language, that we've borrowed a lot of French color names. And sometimes, there'll be a name for a certain thing, like puce, which is actually the French word for flea. Well, no one's going to buy something that's flea color, but they'll buy puce. And sometimes you get the same name, the French word for something and the English word for something, but the colors that they refer to will be totally different. So you get kind of odd quirks like that.
When did blue and pink reverse for boy and girl?
That's a really interesting question. So from what I can tell, the bonds kind of loosened in the first half of the 20th century. So, at the beginning of the 20th century, you get references to blue being the girl's color and pink being the boy's color, likely because blue was really associated with the Virgin Mary and has been since, Renaissance times, medieval times, when the Virgin Mary was usually depicted in blue. And pink was associated with little boys because it was considered kind of just a paler version of red, which was very masculine and associated with soldiers' uniforms. And during the first half of the 20th century, those associations loosened. Soldiers are no longer as associated with red anymore because they're most often wearing khakis. And blue loses that total currency of just being associated with the Virgin Mary. It gets other associations. You've got, uniforms being dyed navy blue and so on and so forth. In the mid-century, you get this real, particularly after the Second World War, you get this explosion of consumer goods aimed at trying to kind of kickstart Western economies after the Second World War. And a lot of these are kind of, because these companies want to get people to buy more. These are often separated by gender, and there's this real desire to produce more goods and separate them into different categories. And I think that's when you really start seeing pink being marketed to women and girls in this very kind of strong way. And it's helped by popular culture. There are a lot of films in the 1950s and 1960s that really play up this kind of idea of pink being feminine, not necessarily soft and girly in the way that we might think of pink as being today. And I think, a lot of those sort of mid-century pinks were quite strident and quite feisty, which is really interesting. But nevertheless, there was kind of a switch around, which is really interesting. My dad, who was born in 1925, for him, pink is his favorite color, and he doesn't think of it as being feminine because he was born at a time when it was still kind of the boys' color. He and his partner both walk with sticks, and his stick is the pink one and hers is the blue one.
I love that. My youngest son wore a pink snowsuit all winter long when he was born. And I can remember women coming up and just being aghast when they found out it was a boy inside. And he looked so good in it. Like it really suited him too. Pink is such a loaded color. It's got connotation, and men throw it around to be disparaging, and other people embrace it. We don't have the same attachment to Kelly green the same way.
No, and it's really surprising because no other pale color, there's pink is kind of given its own category in the way that pale yellows or pale greens, pale blues, you don't have separate categories for them. So pink culturally punches well above its weight in terms of where other similar colors on the spectrum are. Pink is head and shoulders above them. It really has got this massive personality, which is very interesting. And I wonder if that'll be the same in 100 years time. Pink, it feels like it's got this real cultural status, and will that last? I don't know. I hope so. I like pink, but it does feel like it's kind of unusual.
Do you have a favorite color?
I really love ultramarine, which is the classic color that the Virgin Mary is painted in Renaissance portraits and paintings. She's usually wearing this voluminous blue cloak or maybe a blue dress that will be this very beautiful shade of blue that's painted with ultramarine, which is made from lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone. And I love that color just for itself. But I also love it because when I was pitching the book, The Secret Lives of Color, I had a little sort of document, and I went to, an agent, and I went to publishers, and ultramarine, the story of ultramarine would be the story that I told to my agent, and then to publishers who I was hoping would help me publish this book. So I've got a lot of attachment to it as a story. And I think the story of this beautiful color is kind of the most, has always seemed to me like the most convincing argument for why people should care about the story of colors.
Do you find that there's the same history with color harmonies? Was a color always standing on its own, or did you find that there was often, split complementary, or the contrast? Like, take a look at Christmas. It's very strong contrasting colors. Do you find the same kind of history with those?
So it works differently in different contexts. So obviously in art history, if you look at purely sort of pigments used by artists, they talk a lot about contrasts, particularly in the early 20th century, in the very late 19th century. They're really interested in contrasts and what that does to paintings, and so they're really interested in that very specific way of trying to get different colors to work against each other to kind of really bring certain feelings into paintings and create certain effects. You also get a very different type of conversation about the colors and harmonies that might work in fashion, and you get a separate conversation in interiors. If you look at books about interior colors, say from the 18th century, and the colors that they say work together, it's really astonishing. And even more so, say Victorian times, there are books of decoration guides, interiors guides, essentially for Victorian homeowners, produced at the time with kind of colored plates. And the colors that they are suggesting that go together are really strong. We would never consider them today as colors that would go well, that would seem livable. But these were, the very fashionable color contrasts of their day. And the same in fashion. If you read, particularly French have wonderful color combinations in the 18th century. They have all these kind of colors that go together. And again, you would just never wear those combinations today. In part, it's difficult to tell with fashion because the language is so slippery, and you very rarely get exact images to go with, particularly for earlier documents, you very rarely get kind of a visual reference for exactly what they mean. But I think you can even see when if we're looking at magazines, fashion magazines from 40, 50 years ago, very often you'll see things that they're like, these colors go together beautifully, and you'll be like, oh, well, I mean, maybe they did then, but so I think, our eyes and our ideas about what looks good can really change in a very surprising way. And it can change completely in a relatively short period of time. So that idea of colors that go together, complementary colors and opposites, and things that work well, things that are restful, things that are energetic, that is very, very, very culturally determined. and changes a lot.
Did you find that periods of time were defined by just the discovery of new dyes?
So yeah, you really see this in the 19th century when there's just this explosion of new colors. And suddenly artists and people who are interested in interiors have a much greater access to colors at much more affordable prices and can afford to be a lot more adventurous. So from that period on, certainly you get this kind of very different feel. Before then, you'd be very limited as to the colors you had access to. It would really depend on your budget, and it just wasn't possible to decorate and to dress and to put colors together in the same way, unless you had more money than anyone else, possible. Because for example, if we're looking at ultramarine, at times that cost more than gold, and so colors were very often, if you had access to extreme wealth, you would show off a color because it meant that you were wealthy. And so the colors that you're putting it with you're not necessarily doing it because it's tasteful or because it looks good. You're doing it to show your wealth. So the values that you can put on color combinations, the further back you go, it really changes, just because the value of the colors and the access to the colors is so different. It's difficult to understand exactly why people are putting colors together. The values are just different.
Now, your book isn't all about history. You do go into some cutting edge science with Vantablack, and that was really quite fascinating.
It was great fun to research. I got to go and meet the guy who's the sort of scientist who discovered this material, because it's not actually a color at all. It's a material that happens to be, well, it was at that time, actually last year, a blacker black was discovered, but before 2019, Vantablack was the blackest black that the world had ever known. It absorbs 99.965% of light, and it's completely uncanny when you see it. He showed it to me on a kind of, actually I've got a kind of scrumpled up piece of paper. He showed it to me on kind of a scrumpled up piece of aluminium foil, of tin foil, and he, one side was covered with this material, and the other side was just tin foil. And he showed it to me, firstly tin foil side up, and you can see that you can tell this is a scrumpled up piece of paper because it's kind of got different planes of color. And then he flipped it over, and suddenly all you see is just a little black circle, like a black hole. It looks like kind of a mistake, like a tear in reality, and you get no sense of depth at all. All the information that you would usually get from a 3D object, shading and light and different planes, because the Vantablack absorbs so much light, you don't have any of that information. Your brain can't process it, and so it just looks like a flat black area. So it's very uncanny to see it.
I actually went online and took a look at a couple of websites on it, and even on a computer screen, it was amazing. It was like I'm going to say a message from Doctor Who or something like that. It was just like this black hole that if you stared at it, you would lose yourself in. And that was just on a computer screen.
Yeah, there are some very clever kind of animations, because it is quite hard to understand it when you're seeing it on a computer screen. And I think the best representation that I've ever seen is there are some videos that they produced where they have two masks, kind of, representations of people's faces, one just done in metal, and the other one, the metal is coated in Mantablack, and the faces, kind of the masks, turn round slowly. And the one that's coated in Vantablack, you can only tell that it's a face when it's profile side on, when you can sort of see the nose and the lips. But when it turns towards you, it's just a black oval. And the other one, you can still see. And that is the kind of the clearest representation I could see of just exactly how this black works in remotely. If you don't have access to your own sample, that was the clearest representation that I could see that would help people to understand the effect of this material.
So did your research on color, did you have enough left over or trigger enough thoughts that springboarded you into your next book, The Golden Threads? Or was that just a totally different thought? You done with color and then you took up a different subject?
Absolutely not done with color. I mean, the Secret Lives of Color, was its own thing, and I produced it. I'm sort of super proud of it, but it's definitely not stopped me being interested in color. I still write about colors. I'm still finding colors that I wish I'd been able to put into the book. Or, even, this new ultra black that got discovered last year, that's wonderful. It's wonderful. There's now kind of a fight almost for super blacks, that's really exciting to me. So in terms of color, that's still ongoing. That will always remain a passion. But I was looking, when I finished The Secret Lives of Color, I actually, I had been working the whole time that I wrote it. I'd been working at The Economist. That was my job at the time. I was assistant books and arts editor there. And lots of people write books while they're fully employed, but I didn't have a very long period of time in which to write the book, and I completely burnt myself out writing the book while having this full-time job. I was getting up at kind of 5 a.m, writing for 3 hours, then going to work, then coming back at night and writing more, and I just completely burnt myself out. So I handed in my notice. And actually, my last day of work at The Economist was on the Friday, and on the Monday morning, I handed in The Secret Lives of Color. And then the rest of the Monday, I was just like, what have I done? What do I do now? Well, of course, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to write more books. And, given my background, given what I'd studied at university, textiles was kind of a really, logical next step for me. I had been fascinated with textiles. That was where I'd gotten into color. It was at the same time as getting into textiles. And so I started looking into it. And initially I thought I was going to do something quite similar to The Secret Lives of Color, but with textiles. That was one option, sort of covering 75 or 80 or 100 different types of textiles. But it soon became clear to me as I was pulling together a pitch that actually I wanted to kind of dive deeper into each story. Obviously, this meant that I would be able to cover far fewer stories, but I'd be able to go deeper into each one and cover it in a slightly different way. And that was how The Golden Thread was born. I wanted to tell fewer stories, but I wanted to, cover a little bit less ground, but also to delve deeper into these stories and to tell the stories in a slightly different way. The other very interesting thing is that, when I handed in The Secret Lives of Color, I didn't have much hopes, and I don't think my friends and family had big hopes for it. It seemed like a very niche subject. My dad was completely shocked that I'd managed to get a book deal at all. Who will be interested in color? But it soon became clear to me that The Secret Lives of Color actually had really captured people's imaginations. And a lot of people were saying, oh, what are you working on now? And I'd say, I'm working on a pitch for a book about textiles, and I could just see people's faces fall, and just switch off and just say, it was very clear. You just have these people's expressions say, oh, that's not something I'm interested in. That's not a book for me. Which, when you're embarking on a new project that will probably take 3 years of your life, is not something you want to see in the faces of your nearest and dearest. So that was very worrying. And I think part of my mission for The Golden Thread, it sort of became infused with this desire that I had to persuade people that textiles were fascinating and interesting and worthy of greater study. And that, the book, it's only one small book. Textiles is a vast, a vast history. So is color, but, textiles really is, incredibly wide and deep. I was only ever going to be able to cover a tiny proportion of it, skate over the surface, but I wanted to pick stories that would really grab people and that would hopefully spark their curiosity and lead them to delve deeper into this world, which I found really fascinating. So it was kind of it was a little bit of a mission book, I would say.
Well, I think a lot of us in our head has fabric connected with frivolous fashion, women's crafts, so that they're less important. I was really shocked, and I think the book is very valuable. I think everybody should read it, in how textiles actually drove the Industrial Revolution, and listening to how Chinese dynasties negotiated with the Mongol Empire to prevent war with textiles. And all your stories are quite fascinating. And I think it's a good read for anybody, that whether they're involved in quilting or women's craft or handicrafts or whatever, or just the economy at large. There was lots of good information in there. The other thing that I really like about your books, I mean, it's very apparent in color, but you did it with golden textiles, is that they're in nuggets. The colors I could probably read, depending on the day. I could always read about one color before bed. And sometimes I would read about 3 or 4 or 5, and then you could just pick it up the next night, or you could go back and read one again. They were just beautiful little snippets of color. It's a story. It's not a big story. It's all sorts of little stories. And the way that you wrote the golden threads is, it's a bigger story. Like you're saying, you want a bigger story, but even within that, you still had these units. So it was very easy to pick up and read and put down and pick up and read. And, you know, just, you don't have to work, like so often with nonfiction, you're in that part where, oh, there's so much to remember, and there's so many people and so many fancy words and things like that, that when you leave it for a little while, you almost have to go back to the beginning to read it. But even though that there were those words, because, you know, Chinese dynasties and characters and things like that, it was still so very readable.
Yeah, it's funny. I think, you know, with The Secret Lives of Color, the format came very naturally to me because I'd written these kind of short color columns, no more than 400 words. And some of the colors ended up being, you know, double or even triple that. But it was always obvious to me that I wanted to cover a lot of colors. And of course, they all had to sort of be their own thing. I kind of envisioned them each being like a kind of a character sketch of the color. And people really responded to that as readers, and that was something they really loved. And, you know, many people like you just kind of read 1 or 2. They'd read it to children as it's like bedtime stories. It's like, oh, don't read them the mummy one, it's really gross, not before bed. But yeah, that was the way they interacted with it. And I tried to kind of keep some of that, even though the stories are longer. I tried to keep some of that in the golden thread, but even there, each chapter is its own thing. And I'm actually working on a book now that is more one complete story, but I'm still trying to keep some of that feeling of being able to pick it up and put it down, because people really love it. And I think, you know, I find it myself as a reader. I love reading, but some books demand a lot from you. They demand you know, keep all these names in your head. Sometimes you've got sort of weird interconnected families that, you know, the names are very similar and you're like, what is going on? And you've got multi-generation. And that can be wonderful if you're on holiday and you just want to dive in and completely enter a different world. But if, like most people, you're reading, you know, a little bit when you have the time, having those kind of very natural breaks is much easier on you and a lot less demanding of you as a reader. And that's a really wonderful thing. And so I'm trying, it's now this challenge of trying to keep that feeling of being kind of generous with the reader and being kind to the reader while also telling one complete story. So yeah, it's a challenge, but I think readers really love that about The Secret Lives of Color, and they like the snippetiness of the longer chapters in the golden thread. And so this is something clearly that people like. But yes, that's the challenge now, is for this longer book to retain something of that.
Do you have a lot of color in your life, a lot of textile in your life, like textures and that?
I do. I'm sitting here in my bedroom actually, but the office where I usually work is in the sort of bottom of our garden, and that's kind of completely covered in colourful bits and pieces and posters. I love buying art and craft, and I've messed around with it myself, although not very proficiently. So I love colour. It's funny, when I first started, when The Secret Lives of Colour was first published, I noticed that although I really loved colour, I'd kind of fallen into the sort of the slightly lazy approach of dressing, where I was dressing mostly in black. And now I just can't get away with it anymore because my friends are like, oh, but you're the colour person, you can't dress in black. So that I definitely haven't wore black clothes for a little while.
I find black very easy to dress in, but it does nothing for me, and it doesn't do anything for my mood. So I have tried to eliminate black as much as possible, but it's amazing how it's in everything. Like, it's so many things are designed by engineers, and engineers don't really go for color, black and white. I think of Steve Jobs and how he brought color into the computing world, and that seem to have been a big game changer for color in our regular lives. What handicrafts do? You just mentioned that you were picking up something.
Yes, so I haven't found one particular thing. It's actually something that I've struggled with in lockdown, because a big part of my relaxation before lockdown, before 2020, was going out and seeing friends. You know, my work that I do, particularly since going freelance, is very solitary. So, you know, I'm just by myself in the shed, in the garden, and that is my working life. And so before, to relax, I would go out and see friends. Well, you know, that is not possible in 2020. And so it's kind of forced me to go back to some of the things that I used to do, you know, when I worked in a big office to relax. You know, then my relaxation was sort of being more by myself and sort of, you know, doing something a bit more crafty. So I used to sketch a little bit. This year, I've gotten into something that I never thought I'd get into, which is tapestry, which is something that my mother used to do. And I always found hideously boring, but I got into that. I've done a little bit of embroidery. I haven't found the one thing that I completely love yet, but I keep on trying. So I've got sort of some lino that I'm going to sort of do some little lino cuts for Christmas and make little stamps, Christmas cards. Still trying to do some painting. I've ordered some oils, which I used to love working with. I did art at A-level and I used to oil, you know, I did oil painting there and I loved that. So I've always been slightly put off by it because it's quite faffy, and quite a faffy thing to do at home and demands a fair amount of space. But I've given in now that we're in second lockdown and I'm not allowed to see anyone for the next few weeks. And I thought, right, it's now or never. I'm going to see if I can get back into oil painting. So I do a fair amount, but like I said, I haven't found the one thing that completely grabs me. And one thing that I do really want to do, and I feel very guilty because I've got a sewing machine. One thing I do want to do is make my own clothes, which again, I got taught to make clothes at school when I was quite young, and I've completely forgotten how to do it, and I'm now, you know, a bit intimidated by it. So I just need to go on YouTube, which is the resource that could help me unlock this new thing. So we'll see.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. If people want to track you down and subscribe to your newsletter, how do they get a hold of you?
So I'm on both Instagram and Twitter at Kassia St. Clair, and my website is kassiasstclair.com, and I have a link to my newsletter there, which is infrequent but hopefully entertaining when it does come out.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Kassia. I think I could have gone on asking questions for at least another hour. I highly recommend both of her books, The Secret Life of Color and The Golden Thread. I have read both twice. I'll have links to both books, Kassia's website, and her contact info in the notes below. Next up on Karen's Quilt Circle is Jennifer Mankey, and we are going to be talking about quilting for a cause. Last week I uploaded my video unboxing my long arm. If you missed it, I'll put a link in the notes below. And check out some of my other interviews on Karen's Quilt Circle as well. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell beside the subscribe button so that YouTube will notify you when I make new videos. You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest at Just Get It Done Quilts. And of course my website, justgetitdonequilts.com. So take care and I'll see you next time.